I think the first thing to say is that class is obviously a very contested idea, and I think the common sense discussions around class, or the way that it's talked about most commonly, look at it very much in a sociological kind of way. So it would be looking at, you know, lifestyles, attitudes. You know, you get those kind of social attitude surveys that ask, you know, what newspapers you read, whether you eat your peas with a knife, whether you go to the opera, and these kind of things. And these are the kind of things that I think people often think about in terms of how they decide what class they are. Or also ideas of what class people think they are. You know, do you feel middle class? Do you feel working class? What do you identify with? You know, all of these things are very interesting in themselves and can tell us something about society, but they're not what we mean when, you know, as Marxists, when we talk about class. We're not primarily interested in consumption patterns or in managing people effectively or in cultural trends. You know, we're interested in how capitalism can be overthrown. You know, what are the forces that play in the system, and what does that mean for us in terms of how we organise, where we look for the agency that can change the world. And I think to understand that, you have to look at the position people occupy in capitalism in relation to, you know, actual production, in relation to how the system works, and what powers that relationship you have with capital gives you. So Marx's starting point, talking about class, was that it's a relationship and not a thing. You know, it's not an identity or something that you have. It's about your relationship to other people in society and to how things are produced. More specifically, it's, you know, classes are groups of people defined by their specific location relative to the means of production, that is, the things that are used by human beings to produce things, so factories, offices, tools, machinery, etc., and in relationship to other classes, so other groups of people in society. And I think that implies really a central division running through society. That might be landowners and peasants, you know, patriarchs and slaves, the kind of, you know, all kinds of different divisions that we've seen at different points in history. But all of these divisions reflect the exploitation of one class by another. So there's always a class of people who do the labour and another class of people who own or control the means by which that labour is carried out. And I think really it's important at this point just to say that this goes back thousands of years, absolutely, 6,000 to 10,000 years, but it's not eternal. So class isn't something that just exists because that's how human beings are. Friedrich Engels in particular wrote a book called The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, where he really talks about a point in history where classes started to develop for the first time. And I think it's really important just to mention that, because class is related to human beings' ability to produce more than nature could give us by itself, if you see what I mean. It's at some point in history, human beings, rather than just being hunter-gatherers, you know, relying on what was really around them, started to be able to develop the means to produce more, to develop agriculture, to cultivate plants rather than just, you know, collect them or whatever, to domesticate animals and herd them and so on, rather than just hope to catch something when you go out hunting. You know, there was a fundamental break in human history where we started to develop the means to do those things, and that leads to a whole new epoch in human history. I went to the Ice Age art exhibition at the British Museum on Friday, and it's really interesting because you're talking about art from people who existed 40,000, 25,000 years ago, and all the things they produce is beautiful little objects, but they're all kind of things that you can hold in your hand. And it's significant because there was no kind of concept of wealth, of kind of something that exists here that we build our society around. Everything people produced in these kind of hunter-gatherer societies had to be carried with them. You know, there wasn't any kind of wealth in the sense that we understand it today. You know, these were not class societies where one group of people dominated over another because of their relationship to the means of production. At some point that starts to change, you know, so once you get property being produced, the tools that you're using to do that, the ploughs and so on, become much more important in society, much more valuable as property. And, you know, the first classes start to develop simply out of the idea of people, that somebody in your group needs to be freed up from daily labour in order to study the stars and the seasons, so that you can start to understand how to cultivate food, for example. You know, that person might be a priest or whatever. This is a really useful role for society. But very quickly that kind of develops into ruling classes of people who are freed up from labour and actually are then exploiting other people. So in the beginning you're talking about a useful role of someone who needs to have the time to understand the weather or the seasons or whatever. Very quickly you get the ancient Egyptian kings who are completely useless parasites on society, sitting in massive pyramids and, you know, with all the kind of gold and massive objects that represent their power over society. But ever since that point, really, for several thousand years, you're talking about the majority of people labouring and a minority of people freed up from labour, but then in control and exploiting others. I think one accusation always thrown at Marxists is that we're too simplistic about class and kind of, say, oh, there's just workers and capitalists and that's it. I think it's important to say that Marx and Engels always understood that society is complex. So when you're looking back at whatever ancient societies or you're looking at slave-owning societies, it's not the case that in ancient Greece everybody was either a slave owner or a slave. Actually, probably the majority of people had a plot of land of their own, were tilling it, were basically feeding themselves and so on. Things were always complex, but there's always still a central relationship of exploitation that kind of defines that society, and that changes through time. Now, I'm mostly going to talk about, well, in fact, entirely now going to talk about capitalism, because that's the system that we're in. And I think, this is a system that is defined by a relationship of exploitation of capitalists exploiting workers, really. So capitalists defined by their control of the means of production. In capitalism, that means the factories, the offices, the machinery, computers, the raw materials, and so on. You know, that might mean legal ownership of them, the shareholders or whatever, but it can also mean those who actually do the day-to-day running of that system. And so I'm going to look in a bit of detail at who are the ruling class, the working class, and other classes in society today. And again, I'm mostly talking about Britain here in terms of the detail, but of course, you know, again, you could look much wider at other parts of the world, but I think the central dynamic still applies. So the ruling class in Britain today, you know, in Marx's day, you were talking largely about factory owners, say, who owned one or two mills in the north of England. You know, you're talking about the beginnings of a quite relatively early capitalism. Today, of course, things are quite different. You've seen a massive kind of concentration of capital, and world capitalism today is dominated by a relatively small number of really big companies, often multinational, often directly owned by shareholders who may have very little to do with running the company, but who appoint individuals to run them efficiently. And those individuals are paid massive salaries. So you think of someone like Bob Diamond from Barclays Bank, you know, he's not legally the owner of Barclays Bank, but he is absolutely certainly in charge of deciding what goes on. You know, and he was paid something like 21 million in 2011. This is an absolutely tiny class of people, really, with an enormous concentration of wealth and power. In Britain, there's something like 1,100 directors who control companies that have a combined turnover of £2,000 billion. You know, this is actually not a hell of a lot of people. It's quite a small number. Yeah, and it's not just industry. So it's not just production itself. It's also, of course, things like the banks, another big business, but also the government itself is a part of the ruling class here. You know, the state structure that is absolutely essential to capitalism's running, you know, to it being able to operate. So the police and the army, the judiciary, the civil service and so on are all institutions run by the state on behalf of and for the benefit of the capitalist class. And so the people at the top of those institutions as well are, you know, the judges, the top civil servants, heads of government agencies. You know, again, they're not directly organising exploitation of workers, but they are absolutely running some of the key institutions of a capitalist system. And of course, there's a myth put that we live in a meritocracy, that anybody can make it. You know, we can all be Alan Sugar and we can all talk with our East End accent and be at the top of a major corporation. But of course, in reality, it's quite a closed group. You know, occasionally other people will become a part of it, but all you need to do is look at that famous picture of the Bullingdon Club with David Cameron and half of the rest of the cabinet and other, you know, you could pinpoint all of the figures in that picture and see where they are now in the ruling class in Britain today. So public schools like Eton and then Oxbridge kind of train people up, really. And there's still a hell of a lot of hereditary you know, people inheriting their positions in the ruling class in somewhere like Britain today. It's important to say that the capitalist class isn't just one big friendly group of people who all hang out together. Of course, they're in competition with each other as well. You know, and this is a central part of how capitalism operates. But they do have a common interest in exploiting workers and in continuing the system that enables them to do so. You know, they live off the work of other people, and that's what defines them, really. So now I want to look at the class that they live off, you know, the working class in Britain. And this, again, is a really important argument because there's all kinds of ideas about whether the working class still exists, whether it has any power. You know, it's not like the old days, all these kind of ideas. You know, particularly the notion in Britain that the decline of manufacturing industry means, you know, that somehow the working class has disappeared. The service industry isn't the same kind of thing, that it's a different thing, or, you know, which feeds into the kind of new labour idea that they used to put when in power, that we're all middle class now, this is a middle class society because we're all in white collar jobs. So one of the arguments is that the growth in the service sector means that we don't produce anything, that there aren't any real jobs, as people put it. You know, that Thatcher destroyed the miners, the docks, the car plants, the steel industry, and so on. And so partly there's a way in which service jobs are talked about in this quite disparaging way, like somehow if you're a service worker, then you're not as good as if you were a miner or a steel worker. Now, it's absolutely true that manufacturing has declined in Britain. We shouldn't overstate this. It still accounts for like 8% of the workforce. So there's 2.8 million workers in manufacturing, plus another 2.1 million in construction. You know, these workers often work in very large workplaces. They are organised in trade unions. You know, workers like engineers, car manufacturers, and also food production and stuff like this are actually still major industries. And if you think about some of the disputes that have happened recently, then you can still see that kind of manual working class in force, really. So you think about construction workers recently, electricians who've been on strike, you know, bringing a halt to kind of different, you know, plants around the country, the Lindsay oil refinery workers, the Corryton oil refinery, as well as those working at Ford's and other places. There are still these major industries that are still very important to the working class movement in Britain. But one of the other things to note is that, of course, part of the reason that manufacturing jobs have gone is because manufacturing has become more productive because of new machinery and so on. So actually a smaller number of workers can produce more than more workers used to produce in the past. In Britain, for example, manufacturing reached an all-time high in 2007 in terms of actual output. Britain remains the 6th biggest manufacturer in the world. Manufacturing is 12% of the GDP. So, you know, so if you look at the car industry in particular, over the last 30 years, there's been a massive fall in numbers of workers employed in the car industry, but car production itself has hardly fallen at all. So in the 1970s, Britain produced about 1.7 million cars a year. That was at the height of the industry in terms of numbers of people employed. By 2005, they were still producing 1.6 million. So it's only fallen by 0.1 million cars, but there's a hell of a lot fewer workers. You know, one car worker today can produce 8 times what their predecessors could 30 years ago. So this means that the manufacturing workers that do still exist are incredibly powerful. You know, if 50 workers can bring a halt to an industry that previously would have had to take 400 workers to bring a halt to it, then, you know, you can see how powerful actually those workers still are. And I want to look at the arguments around service industry, because I think it's also true that a lot of jobs that are classified as service industry are actually very similar in terms of the experience of work to manufacturing jobs. Chris Harman pointed out in an article called The Workers of the World that workers who are putting beans in a can are called manufacturing workers, and workers who are taking beans out of a can in a canteen are called service workers. You know, there's not a lot of difference between the operation that they're doing, but they're just categorised differently. And of course, service work isn't a new thing. Services have always made up a sizable proportion of the workforce, even at the height of manufacturing. And particularly if you think about Victorian England in the beginning of the 20th century, massive numbers of people, particularly women, employed in the service industry, you know, in literally as maids and so on. But as industrial production grows through the 20th century, it also creates the need for all kinds of other services to allow it to function. So every job manufacturing cars on a production line at Ford's, there needs to be an increase in jobs matching it in services, you know, transporting components from one plant to another, getting the finished cars to the showroom, getting workers to and from work, feeding them in canteens, all of the paperwork, the finance and so on. You know, all of these service jobs are actually intrinsically linked to manufacturing as well. You know, it's not necessarily all that useful to kind of separate them out in your head in terms of what's important and what isn't. You know, capitalism has expanded and so services have grown too. And because more and more people work, obviously particularly women, in the course of the last 50 years or whatever, a lot of the jobs that would have previously been performed in the home are kind of entirely or partly taken on outside of the home. So fast food industry, laundrettes, whatever, you know, all these kind of things have been turned into commodities, you know, not to mention the expansion of education, healthcare, and so on. I think what you've seen in the service industries is also a kind of the same pressures as elsewhere, you know, to kind of centralise, to create these big hubs, you know, massive distribution warehouses for Tesco's and stuff like this. So Tesco's is one of the biggest private sector employers in the UK. It's concentrated all of its distribution of food and goods in about 6 massive warehouses around the country. And a lot of these massive corporations, they operate on this kind of just-in-time basis. So actually, if something goes wrong in that operation, then you've got a whole lot of shops are in trouble. You know, there's every high street would notice it. You know, if Tesco's came to a halt, really. So I think the argument that we're all middle class now, coming to that, is problematic, you know, because I think there's an idea of what do we mean by middle class? That you have a white collar job, maybe you sit at a desk, use a computer, rather than, you know, wearing overalls and a cap, presumably. Lots of white collar workers, people like teachers, university lecturers, all kinds of you know, office workers, people working in local government and civil service, design and technology and so on. A lot of these jobs were maybe considered middle class jobs, but they've actually, again, more and more pressure on those kind of jobs has made the experience of those kind of careers really very similar to other more traditionally regarded working class jobs. I think, you know, in the 19th century, there was an idea that clerical workers were kind of quite a privileged group compared to the people kind of sweating away in mines or factories. And there was a certain level of a kind of security in those kind of jobs and so on, because they were quite skilled. But I think even in Victoria times, we shouldn't exaggerate this. I think if anyone's read A Christmas Carol, Bob Cratchit is not like a privileged worker here. You know, I think there was already a sense of, you know, the kind of office workers being under massive pressure and so on. And I think that's massively increased through the 20th century. If you think about the growth of call centres, you know, all aspects of banking and finance and all kinds of services are dealt with by operatives over the phone and so on. These are technically white-collar jobs, but they're not a pleasant experience or some kind of privileged or secure role in society. And the growth of all those other services that I already mentioned to do with the expansion of capitalism means that more and more people are pulled into these kind of jobs. But even those jobs that were even more recently seen as quite privileged, being a university lecturer or that kind of thing, have also seen a kind of deterioration in the conditions, more and more pressure, more and more internal competition the same kind of pressures that exist elsewhere. Now, I do think there is a middle class though. It's not one homogenous group, but there are various kind of groups in society who don't fall into the category of being, you know, a wage slave, someone who has to sell their labour power and to produce for capitalism, or the ruling class who own and control the means of production. I think in Marx and Engels' time, when they talked about the middle class, that this was quite a large layer in society in terms of small capitalists. That was the classic idea, the petty bourgeoisie. These being people who maybe own a shop, own a bit of the means of production, but really don't employ very many people, maybe employ probably members of their family and a handful of others or whatever. And I think clearly these people still exist. So you can think about people who run small businesses, shops, pubs, whatever, you know, plumbers and so on, people who are self-employed. But even today, you know, more and more these people are pulled into actually bigger corporations. So when you think there used to be little shops on all the streets, and now they're getting increasingly taken over by Tesco Express or Sainsbury's Local or whatever. And so the same people who might have been working in a local shop run by a family are now employed by a huge multinational corporation. But I do think there has been a massive expansion in what is called the new middle class. You know, so as capitalism has developed and grown, it has required more and more kind of professional or managerial roles in order to keep it running. I think as capitalism has created more and more workers and encompassed all aspects of society, the ruling class needs both those with technical skill and expertise, but also those to control and manage those workers. So there are lots of people who are managers of some sort, like people who are salaried. You know, they work for a big capitalist, so they are employed. They're selling their labour power, in essence. But they do have a greater degree of autonomy over their work. They help to control the labour process and the exploitation of the workforce. So this is a kind of a layer of managers, of top civil servants, police chiefs, people who are paid more than the value of the labour that they actually perform, but whose role is very important in terms of helping a capitalist to exploit the people. So I think in terms of the middle class, there's two processes at work. You've got the massive teachers, health workers, lecturers, journalists, bank workers and so on, kind of being pushed down into the working class, you know, and really finding their conditions more and more similar to other workers. And then you've got a minority pushed in the other direction, really, professional managerial layer, consciously co-opted in order to help run the system on behalf of capitalism. But even that layer isn't cohesive, you know, there are different ends to it. I have a friend who is a manager. She is in charge of a team of people in some private company in the city. You know, she is paid more than the people who she is meant to manage, but increasingly, you know, she ends up having to do the work as well. You know, she's very much on the office floor with them and so on. Her interests are very often pulled in the direction of the workers that she's kind of managing. On the other hand, you get the kind of top managers, the principals, heads of biggest schools, top architects and so on, medical consultants maybe, high ranks in the armed forces, other people who are actually pulled quite separate from the working class, from other people in their own profession, who see themselves as part of the opinion makers, the decision makers in society, and really see their interests as lying with the ruling class. So I think, you know, when Marx and Engels talked about the middle class, they talked about contradictory pressures on them and how they could be pulled either way in the class struggle. And I think that's absolutely still the case today. Yeah, I think to end, I think it's important that as Marxists we have a kind of objective analysis of what class is and how we can kind of define it inside of society, you know, a specific society like ours today. But our key task is always dealing with the subjective in a way. It's dealing with how can we understand those classes in order to shift things. And I think that, you know, having a class position in society, identifying class positions, also means identifying interests. You know, what is the class interests of a group of people, and so on. You know, I think that's what the next session in this kind of mini course is going to be dealing with, how do workers become revolutionary. And I'm not going to talk about that now, but I think, you know, it's crucial that having an understanding of an objective situation doesn't mean everything just automatically then flows from that. It means you have to intervene and understand how to pull things in one direction rather than the other. I think the final thing to say is just kind of going back to the beginning in terms of how Marx and Engels identified class first arising in society, because it's really important, because it says something about why capitalism is unique and why the working class is different from any previous class in society. Because I think when Engels talked about class arising, he showed how it arose almost out of necessity. In fact, absolutely out of necessity. You know, in order to develop the productive forces of society, in order to be able to move forward for everyone, you know, to produce more, to be able to feed and clothe and house ourselves better, to be able to expand, to be able to settle, to sustain a larger population, and all of these things. In order to do that, you had to almost create classes. You had to have some people freed up from the daily grind of gathering and hunting and so on. So class was kind of necessary. And throughout society, up until this point, you know, it's been necessary for some people to be in control and other people to be exploited in order to keep pushing the productive means of society forward. I think what capitalism has done is it's brought us to a situation, you know, where our labour can produce so much that this is no longer necessary. It is no longer necessary for a minority of society to own and control the wealth and a majority to be exploited. You know, class now only exists to kind of maintain the rule of the ruling class. It doesn't have any useful function in terms of human society. And that's why I think the working class is so important to us, because it's about the potential, the possibility for the first time in human history of actually getting rid of class altogether, you know, in terms of moving forwards to a society based on equality and on really everybody being able to partake in the things that they produce, in the things that we produce as human beings in society. And that's why, you know, I think it's really important to understand where it arises as a social relationship, not as something natural or something that's about human nature, because it also tells us something about how it can end, you know, and how we can go forward. Cheers.